I have for you today, on this very Merry Christmas, a short essay by G.K. Chesterton on Charles Dickens, the rather famous author of The Christmas Carol, which is an omnipresent movie in Advent, actually. Tends to disappear right after the actual Christmas holiday when the Christmas season begins for us Catholics. You also notice that now uh, the little red Santa hat is gone because it is now the Feast of the Nativity, and it's time to get a little more serious about Christmas. So, enough of that. On to G.K. Chesterton. The mystery of Christmas is in a manner identical with the mystery of Dickens. If ever we adequately explain the one, we may adequately explain the other. And indeed, in the treatment of the two, the chronological or historical order must in some degree be remembered. Before we come to the question of what Dickens did for Christmas, we must consider the question of what Christmas did for Dickens. In the historic celebration of Christmas as it remains from Catholic times in certain northern countries, and it is to be remembered that in Catholic times the northern countries were, if possible, more Catholic than anybody else, there are three qualities which explain, I think, its hold upon the human sense of happiness, especially in such men as Dickens. There are three notes of Christmas, so to speak, which are also notes of happiness, and which the pagans and the utopians forget. If we state what they are in the case of Christmas, it will be quite sufficiently obvious how important they are in the case of Dickens. The first quality is what may be called the dramatic quality. The happiness is not a state, it is a crisis. All the old customs surrounding the celebration of the birth of Christ are made by human instinct so as to insist and re-insist upon this crucial quality. Everything is so arranged that the whole household may feel, if possible, as a household does when a child is actually being born in it. The thing is a vigil, and a vigil with a definite limit. People sit up at night until they hear the bells ring, or they try to sleep at night in order to see their presents the next morning. Everywhere there is a limitation, a restraint. At one moment the door is shut. At the moment after, it is opened. The hour has come or it has not come. The parcels are undone or they are not undone. There is no evolution of Christmas presents. This sharp and theatrical quality and pleasure, which human instinct and the mother wit of the world has wisely put into the popular celebrations of Christmas, is also a quality which is essential in such a romantic literature as Dickens wrote. In romantic literature, the hero and heroine must indeed be happy, but they must also be unexpectedly happy. This is the first connecting link between literature and the old religious feast. This is the first connecting link between Dickens and Christmas. The second element is to be found in all such festivity and all such romance, is the element which is represented as well as it could be represented by the mere fact that Christmas occurs in the winter. It is the element not merely of contrast, but actually of antagonism. It preserves everything that was best in the merely primitive or pagan view of such ceremonies or such banquets. If we are carousing, at least we are warriors carousing. We hang above us, as it were, the shields and battle axes with which we must do battle with the giants of the snow and hail. All comfort must be based on discomfort. Man chooses when he wishes to be most joyful the very moment when the whole material universe is most sad. It is this contradiction and mystical defiance which gives a quality of manliness and reality to the old winter feast which is not characteristic of the sunny felicities of the earthly paradise. And this curious element has been carried out even in all the trivial jokes and tasks that have always surrounded such occasions as these. The object of the jovial customs was not to make everything artificially easy. On the contrary, it was rather to make everything artificially difficult. Idealism is not only expressed by shooting an arrow at the stars. The fundamental principle of idealism is also expressed by putting a leg of mutton at the top of a greasy pole. There is in all such observances a quality which can be called only the quality of divine obstruction. For instance, in the game of Snapdragon, that admirable occupation, the conception is that raisins taste much nicer if they are brands saved from the burning. About all Christmas things there is something a little nobler, if only nobler in form and theory, than mere comfort. Even holly is prickly. It is not hard to see the connection of this kind of historic instinct with a romantic writer like Dickens. The healthy novelist must always play Snapdragon with his principal characters. He must always be snatching the hero and the heroine like raisins out of the fire. The third great Christmas element is the element of the grotesque. The grotesque is the natural expression of joy, and all the utopians and new Edens of the poets fail to give a real impression of enjoyment, very largely because they leave out the grotesque. A man in most modern utopias cannot really be happy. He is too dignified. A man in Morris's earthly paradise cannot really be enjoying himself. He is too decorative. When real human beings have real delights, they tend to express them entirely in grotesques. I might almost say entirely in goblins. On Christmas Eve, one may talk about ghosts so long as they are turnip ghosts, but one would not be allowed, I hope, in any decent family, to talk on Christmas Eve about astral bodies. The boar's head of old Yule time was as grotesque as the donkey's head of Bottom the Weaver, but there is only one set of goblins quite wild enough to express the goodwill of Christmas. Those goblins are the characters of Dickens. All Dickens' books are Christmas books, but this is still truest of his 2 or 3 famous Yuletide tales, The Christmas Carol and The Chimes, and the Cricks of the Hearth. Of these, The Christmas Carol is beyond comparison the best as well as the most popular. Indeed, Dickens is in so profound and spiritual a sense a popular author that in his case, unlike most others, it can generally be said that the best work is the most popular. It is for Pickwick that he is best known, and upon the whole it is for Pickwick that he is best worth knowing. In any case, the superiority of The Christmas Carol makes it convenient for us to take it as an example of the generalizations already made. If we study the very real atmosphere of rejoicing and a riotous charity in The Christmas Carol, we shall find that all 3 marks I have mentioned are unmistakably visible. The Christmas Carol is a happy story first, because it describes an abrupt and dramatic change. It is not only the story of a conversion, but of a sudden conversion, as sudden as the conversion of a man at a Salvation Army meeting. Popular religion is quite right in insisting on the fact of a crisis in most things. It is true that the man at the Salvation Army meeting would probably be converted from the punch bowl, whereas Scrooge was converted to it. That only means that Scrooge and Dickens represented a higher and more historic Christianity. And my second essay for you today from Chesterton is something I've been holding on to for 2 years, actually. I keep meaning to do this one on Christmas, and then I forget. So we're going to do it this time. And this is his essay called On Santa Claus. It's actually pretty rare. And I'm not going to, this is not a publishing endorsement of Santa Claus from me, the Santa myth. A lot of people get really uptight about the Santa thing. I don't plan to teach my child that Santa is real, just so people don't get any weird ideas. All right, anyway, Chesterton on Santa Claus. The sole test as to whether Santa Claus is genuine is simply whether he is recognized. Mr. Littlewood has probably adopted in his little monograph on Santa Claus the best method of dealing with a difficult matter in a simple way. He has taken such mythical or historical figures as may be colorably supposed to have contributed to the popular traditions, and treated them separately as so many separate men, calling them Santa Claus the Saint, Santa Claus the Pagan, and so on. This enables him to tell in a clear and graceful way, as if for very intelligent children, a series of stories. But its disadvantage is that none of them is properly the story of Santa Claus. Intelligent children, whether they believed or not in the sacred and benevolent burglary every Christmas Eve, would feel that the Magi, the saint, the heathen, etc., did not really make up the image of the old man with the furred coat and the reindeers. Or if they did not feel so, they would have developed their intelligence at the ruinous expense of their childhood. But indeed, in such cases, childhood and intelligence fail together. There are 3 or 4 films or veils of peculiar modern ignorance which make the true statement of such popular quote-unquote extra belief very difficult. The first is that men in our restless capitalist society cannot understand that tradition, if it exists at all. It is always much fresher and more forcible than anything else. The second thing not understood is that agnosticism cuts both ways. The third is that even the credulity of the populace has generally been a creative credulity of their own, not a mere gaping acceptance of sacerdotal conjuring tricks. The fourth is that the religious really domesticate their deities. And the fifth is that in things of the imagination, unlike things of reason, the form is the spirit. To apply these few tests very briefly in their order is perhaps the best way of blocking in the main realities about so popular yet so mysterious a figure. The point about tradition is this, that it is only called antiquated, nay, it is only thought of as old, when it does not exist at all. Certain ladies have probably painted their faces red ever since the ancient Britons painted their faces blue, but we do not think of the red paint as old because it has been successfully handed on. It is a real tradition. We think of the blue paint as old because it has not been handed on and is not a tradition. Now, whenever tradition is thus presented at all, it must be more vivid and convincing than any records or theories, and this is obviously so in the case of the Christmas legend. Suppose somebody tried to persuade you or me that there had been no such thing as a Christmas festivity and excitement in the time of our grandfathers or great-grandfathers. It would be totally useless for them to tell us that letters had come to light showing that a non-existent ceremony had been invented as a practical joke on Washington Irving as an American, that in the original manuscript in the British Museum, Dickens wrote a Candlemas Carol, and that it is altered in a later hand to a Christmas Carol, that Sir Roger de Coverley in his Christmas is a forgery written in a short time ago by Bernard Shaw, that Grimaldi with his dying breath had declared that he had acted in pantomimes toward the end of December solely out of respect for the stoning of St. Stephen, or any number of such detailed alterations. We should not think these disposed of all the evidence of Christmas, for the simple reason that we could not so much as remember all the evidences of Christmas. If 1,000 more memories of it were thus explained, we should know there were 1,000,000 more not explained. This is the first thing about Santa Claus. He is a tradition. That is, he is a fact. We may not know where he came from, but we know what he is, and if anybody says that he is a heathen, I answer with authority that he is not. The second thing misunderstood is the right kind of agnosticism. Our ignorance about fairy tales refers back to that ultimate ignorance about life, which makes life itself a fairy tale. Some complain that parents will not tell their children whether Santa Claus exists or not. The parents do not tell them for the excellent reason that the parents do not know. Those who have thought their way deepest into the mysteries of man's life and nature have generally tended to the idea that there were principles and very probable personal principles behind the energies and places, seasons, occupations, and periods of life. These speculations have generally and perhaps wisely been left indefinite and separated from the clear religious doctrines needed for the conduct of life. But they are quite sufficiently suggestive to make agnosticism cut, as I have said, both ways, and make a philosophical father at least as doubtful of rationalist explanations as of a supernatural tale. He knows precious little more than the child knows. Parents sleep all night, and generally more heavily than children, and rationalistic parents sleep all day as well. The third point is more obvious, but even more neglected. Here it need only be mentioned to correct what has gone before. It should always be remembered that dogmatic and authoritative religions spend much of their time rather in restraining superstitions than encouraging them, and that such enthusiasms as that which Protestants call Mariolatry generally display all the merits and defects of a widespread democratic movement. If saints such as St. Nicholas of the Children do not exist, they were not a priestly deception, but an erroneous public opinion. The fourth fact is a necessary one to realize, is that when the faithful in any real religion say that a certain thing historically happened once, they do not feel it as inconsistent with the idea that it actually happens constantly. If Tintoretto or Veronese painted himself, his family, his friends, his dog in the same room with the Virgin and Child, it was because he really thought that these things could be in a room together. In other words, that though that child had grown up and lived and been crucified by the princes of the world, he still really was a child, and his mother the mother of a child. In the same way, if there is anything in Mr. Littlewood's ingenious suggestion that Santa Claus bringing presents has a trace of the wise men bringing gifts to Bethlehem, there is no inconsistency in the Christian mind between his historically and literally having brought gifts on that occasion, and his really and truly bringing gifts every 25th of December. The heathen mind now ruling our society must accept it as a paradox. The last point to remember is that in these things, form is everything. You can restate doctrine, though it is not being done very intelligently, because one clear logical meaning can be put in many verbal forms. You cannot restate a vision. You can express the same thought in Greek or in Turkish or in Norman French, but you cannot express the same thought in Greek architecture and Turkish architecture and Norman architecture. Hence, all attempts to clothe Santa Claus in the symbols of other religions or older civilizations, of which Mr. Littlewood's book shows here and there a trace, sin against the first principle of poetry. Santa Claus may have brought his presents from the east to his reindeer from the north, but he has brought them to our house, and the only test of whether he is genuine is whether he is recognized.